They have their own flag, their own languages that sound nothing like anything spoken around them. Now, their own faith, led by a living leader who guides millions. Yet, they remain trapped inside a country that never truly integrated them. How is it possible that a people with such a complete identity still don't have a territory recognized on the map? And why do so many governments avoid even mentioning the issue, as if they were afraid of what might happen if this story ever came to light? There is a place in the heart of Central Asia that most people overlook, yet it has enough weight to redraw the world map in the coming years, and that is no exaggeration. It is the kind of spot where a small political spark can turn into a diplomatic earthquake, especially when decades of geopolitical tension have been quietly piling up. The five stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, form the perfect backdrop for silent disputes. But among them, there is one territory that looks tiny on paper, yet holds disproportionate influence. That territory is Gorno-Badakhshan, an almost forgotten piece inside Tajikistan, so isolated it feels like it exists in its own timeline. It covers 45% of the entire country while holding only 2% of the population. A contrast that always draws the attention of anyone who understands how breakaway movements begin. For many analysts, that imbalance creates exactly the kind of environment where an autonomous region starts questioning who should truly decide its future. When so few people occupy so much land, uncomfortable questions always surface. And it is precisely this explosive combination of vast territory, a small population, and a deeply layered identity that has fueled growing whispers about a potential independence movement. Nothing official, of course, but murmured in the streets of Korog, in mountain cafes, and inside diaspora groups around the world. When a place this remote begins collecting its own stories, its own culture, and even its own flags, something is bound to shift. And the real reason behind that shift is going to surprise a lot of people. The mountains of Gorno-Badakhshan are not just massive, they dominate everything. Elevation averages above 11,500 feet, creating the kind of environment where oxygen runs low, but identity runs deep. For the people who live there, crossing a valley can mean traveling miles, and every village develops at its own pace. This kind of isolation has always been fertile ground for communities that form distinct cultures, especially when an ethnic minority is trying to preserve its roots under outside pressure. The regional capital, Korog, looks small at first glance. Just 30,000 people tucked into the meeting point of rivers that shape the city like a natural puzzle. But its geography acts like an invisible fortress. It separates, protects, and also fuels old debates about border dispute and belonging. In regions where mountains draw better borders than anything printed on a map, the feeling of being distant from the rest of the country only grows stronger. This mix of extreme altitude and long-term isolation has already produced new nations in other parts of the world, which is exactly why so many scholars keep a close eye on it. When a territory spends decades living apart, the idea of a separatist movement eventually emerges, even if no one admits it openly. And no matter how hard Tajikistan tries to keep everything under control, anyone familiar with the area knows geography does more than create barriers. It creates convictions. Convictions that become even clearer once we look at the people who actually live there. Pamiri stand out the moment you meet them, not because they try to, but because they seem to live in a parallel story compared to the rest of Tajikistan. They do not see themselves as ethnic Tajiks. In truth, they belong to a distinct group with traditions that survived for centuries, thanks to isolation. Their languages, Shugni, Waki, Russiani, sound like distant relatives of Persian, carrying living memories of a people who have always felt sidelined by the state. And that sense of distance quietly fuels discussions about autonomous region inside academic circles. But perhaps the most striking difference is religious. While most of the country follows Sunni Islam, Pamiris practice Ismailism, a unique branch of Shia Islam whose living leader, the Aga Khan, plays a major role in community life. This divergence creates a kind of geopolitical tension that rarely makes headlines, but shapes the relationship between the government and local communities. In sensitive regions, not following the dominant religion always brings political implications that go far beyond faith. Then there is the symbol that unites them, the Pamiri flag, a white field crossed by diagonal green and red stripes. A source of pride for roughly 350,000 Pamirs worldwide, more than 200,000 living in Gorno-Badakhshan alone. It is no coincidence that experts say whenever an ethnic minority has its own language, its own religion, and its own flag, it eventually rethinks its place within the country. And that reflection becomes even sharper once we dive into the turbulent history that shaped the region. The history of Gorno-Badakhshan feels like a film played in reverse. It begins with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the region was almost dragged by inertia into the newly independent Tajikistan. Moscow abandoned its empire, but left behind borders that ignored local identities entirely, creating friction that experts would later classify as classic triggers for independence movement. Nothing there was designed to function organically. Going back a few decades, the 1920s mark another critical moment, when Soviet officials drew the borders of Central Asia the same way someone reorganizes drawers. It was a technical and cold process that overlooked deep cultural differences, something that would later fuel border dispute across the continent. Naturally, it left Gorno-Badakhshan trapped inside decisions made by cartographers who had never set foot at that altitude. It was an old imperial logic redrawn on engineering tables. And the story goes even further back into the 19th century, when the so-called Great Game between the Russian Empire and the British Empire sliced Badakhshan as if it were a board game reward. Before that, the region already had its own shine, an ancient kingdom known for lapis lazuli and for valleys that connected the Silk Road. Once you understand that past, it becomes clear why a separatist movement found such fertile ground there. And all of it gains even sharper contours when we remember what happened right after Tajikistan became independent. When Tajikistan plunged into civil war between 1992 and 1997, Gorno-Badakhshan became the stage for something the central government never saw coming. In the middle of the chaos, local leaders went as far as declaring a temporary independence, a symbolic gesture, but a powerful one, that revived long-standing debates about identity. It wasn't just rebellion. It was the reaction of an ethnic minority tired of being ignored. And in many ways, it opened the door to conversations that would never truly disappear. Out of that moment came Lali Badakhshan, known as the Rubies of Badakhshan, the party that crystallized the region's separatist aspirations. They presented their own flag, green, white, and black, and mobilized support from communities that saw in it the possibility of a different future. To the government, it looked like a political threat. To many Pamiras, it was the most concrete attempt yet to transform an autonomous region into something bigger. The problem is that the peace that followed changed the tone of the entire story. The 1997 agreement promised autonomy, representation, and respect for the specific character of Gorno-Badakhshan, but very little of that ever materialized. The party was banned, yet the ideas stayed alive, moving quietly through families, community leaders, and diaspora networks around the world. And like every broken promise, it only deepened the feeling of abandonment. A feeling that resurfaced every time the region was pressured, and the next crisis would make that painfully clear. Over the years, Gorno-Badakhshan fell into an almost predictable, though deeply uncomfortable pattern: rising tension, protests, crackdowns, and the replacement of local leadership. It was like watching a cycle no one could break. The events of 2012, 2014, and 2018 all followed the same script. But it was in 2022, in Korog, that all the accumulated resentment erupted in the most visible way yet. To many observers, this repetitive pattern looked like natural fuel for any separatist movement taking shape. The root of the conflict has two layers, and ignoring either of them would be naive. Economically, Gorno-Badakhshan sits on routes that connect Tajikistan to China. Yet most of the profits stay in Dushanbe, leaving the region with weak infrastructure and a lingering sense of neglect. Culturally, the tension is even sharper. Restrictions on Pamiri languages in official documents opened a deep wound between the people and the state. Residents often voiced a bitter comparison, paying taxes to a government that insists on denying their own language. These frustrations, combined with the presence of an ethnic minority that once experienced de facto autonomy, make dissatisfaction grow stronger with every cycle. It is as if each new crackdown opens a window to deeper questions about destiny and belonging. And for those who follow the situation closely, the inevitable question becomes, what happens if this cycle never stops? That question becomes even more intriguing once we examine what the real path to independence would look like. Talking about independence is never simple, but imagining a hypothetical scenario helps reveal what is truly at stake. Many experts say that processes like this usually unfold in 3 phases. In the first phase, protests in Korog would intensify to the point of breaking any attempt at central control, clearing the way for a political escalation that could mobilize not just civilians, but also local groups that see the region as something far more significant than a simple autonomous region. That is the moment when long-standing tensions take on a concrete form. The second phase would be full de facto autonomy. At this stage, Pamiri leaders would control roads, crossing points, and even areas near the Chinese border. A parallel administration would emerge, which, according to analysts, could even negotiate directly with Beijing to maintain trade and stability. Situations like this are not unheard of in Central Asia, especially in isolated regions that have always lived in the shadow of decisions made far from their mountains. Geography, once again, would shape politics. The third phase would bring the formal step, the creation of a Pamiri Republic. It sounds bold, but not impossible. On the positive side, there is a distinct identity, potential Chinese interest, and a strong cultural foundation. Working against it are a small population, around 230,000, a vulnerable economy, and the risk of pressure coming from Afghanistan. Some scholars even speculate whether the Asia Khan could turn the region into the spiritual center of Ismailism. And that raises an even bigger question, one tied directly to global stability. When people hear about Gorno-Badakhshan, many picture a distant, isolated conflict. But seasoned analysts know that any shift there could act like a spark in a geopolitical powder keg. A successful independence movement would set a dangerous precedent for other regions dealing with internal tensions, especially inside Russia, where several autonomous regions live in fragile balance. That possibility alone is enough to trigger alarms in governments afraid of becoming the next domino piece. It shows how a small territory can have an outsized impact. On the economic front, things get even more serious. The trade routes linking China to Central Asia cross strategic corridors, and any disruption would force countries to redesign entire transportation flows. A shift like that could affect billion-dollar agreements, increase border pressure, and revive old debates about border dispute between regional powers. This is not a local issue. It is a complex game where each move generates international ripple effects. Every decision shapes the balance of power. There is also a deeper legacy at play: the artificial borders left behind by the Soviet era, which ignored languages, cultures, and identities. Tajikistan, the only non-Turkic country in the region, has always struggled to form strong alliances, making this situation even more delicate. When you combine an ethnic minority with a historic inclination toward autonomy and neighbors with competing strategic interests, you get a pressure point no one can easily control. And everything becomes even clearer when we look at the Pamiri diaspora spread across the world. The Pamiri diaspora is far larger and more influential than most people realize. Moscow is home to roughly 32,000 Pamiris. Pakistan has more than 30,000, and even New York hosts a small community of around 300. Each group maintains strong ties to Gorno-Badakhshan, sending financial, educational and cultural support back home. That kind of connection creates a network that, according to researchers, can quietly strengthen any independence movement that begins to gain traction in the region. These communities act as living bridges between tradition and modern life. In several historical cases, like Armenia and Eritrea, diasporas played decisive roles in supporting political projects far from home. For the Pamiris, their global presence helps keep conversations alive about geopolitical tension and representation, especially when news of repression travels instantly through social media. This constant flow of information reinforces emotional unity among Pamirs, separated by thousands of miles. Another key element is the Aga Khan Development Network, which operates as an alternative infrastructure for education, health, and development. For many Pamiris, this network provides more stability than the state itself, and that raises an uncomfortable question. If 150,000 Pamiris live outside the region, who truly benefits from Gorno-Badakhshan remaining part of Tajikistan? That kind of question turns the diaspora into a crucial actor, and its influence becomes even more relevant when we shift our attention to the country with more power in the region than any other. China watches Gorno-Badakhshan with careful precision. The region shares a direct border with Xinjiang, where nearly 50,000 Pamiris live, linking to worlds that share culture, language, and history. There is also the narrow Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan, a strategic buffer zone for Beijing. In such delicate environments, any talk of autonomy sparks deeper debates about geopolitical tension, especially because border stability is a non-negotiable priority for China. The Belt and Road Initiative relies on routes that pass through some of Central Asia's most sensitive areas, and Gorno-Badakhshan is one of them. For that reason, some analysts speculate that Beijing might, under certain conditions, prefer negotiating with an economically dependent Pamiristan rather than dealing with an unstable Tajikistan. It wouldn't be the first time China adjusted its approach based on strategic interests. Just look at how it manages its own autonomous region. And this kind of strategic flexibility always comes with silent yet unmistakable signals. The truth is simple. Any push for independence there would be impossible without China's approval, and almost inevitable with it. The precedents of Tibet and Taiwan show that Beijing responds to sovereignty issues with calculated precision. But the game in Gorno-Badakhshan is far more intricate, involving connected cultures, vital trade routes, and a patchwork of competing international interests. And that leaves specialists asking the same lingering question: what exactly is China's endgame? For now, the answer remains wrapped in silence. In the end, Gorno-Badakhshan reveals something straightforward: one identity. History and conviction move together. No border stays stable forever. And the world only ignores that truth until the next shift erupts right in front of us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep exploring separatist movements, geopolitics, and the invisible forces reshaping the world map.